What's up, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. Today we're diving into one of the most fascinating periods in American history, and trust me, this story has everything. Corruption, violence, massive fortunes, and the unintended birth of organized crime as we know it. We're talking about Prohibition, the noble experiment that turned ordinary citizens into criminals and created the legendary American Mafia. Stick around because this tale of bootleggers versus the FBI is absolutely wild. Picture this. It's January 17th, 1920. The United States has just passed the 18th Amendment, making the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol completely illegal. The government thought they were solving America's drinking problem, but instead, they created the perfect storm for organized crime. What happened next was like something out of a movie, except it was real, and it changed America forever. So why did America ban alcohol in the first place? The temperance movement had been building for decades, led by groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They genuinely believed that alcohol was the root of all social problems: domestic violence, poverty, crime. The idea was simple: remove alcohol and you remove these problems. But as we'll see, they couldn't have been more wrong about what would actually happen. The moment Prohibition went into effect, something incredible happened. Americans didn't just stop drinking, they went absolutely crazy trying to get alcohol. Within hours, people were stockpiling booze, and by the end of the first week, underground speakeasies were already popping up in major cities. The demand was so massive that it created an instant black market worth millions of dollars. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Before Prohibition, most criminals were small-time operators, pickpockets, burglars, maybe some gambling. But alcohol prohibition created an opportunity unlike anything America had ever seen. Suddenly, there was this massive, profitable industry that was completely illegal, and someone had to fill that gap. Enter the bootleggers, and these guys weren't messing around. The bootlegging business was incredibly complex. You had smugglers bringing alcohol from Canada and Mexico, moonshiners producing it in hidden stills, and distributors getting it to speakeasies. The profit margins were insane. A case of whiskey that cost $10 to produce could sell for $100 or more. We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry in today's money, and it was all controlled by criminals. And then there was Al Capone. This guy became the face of Prohibition-era crime, and for good reason. Capone didn't just run a bootlegging operation, he built an empire. By 1929, his Chicago outfit was making an estimated $100 million a year, which is over $1.5 billion in today's money. He controlled politicians, judges, and police officers. He was basically running a shadow government. While criminals were getting rich, ordinary Americans were living double lives. Speakeasies, illegal bars, became the social hubs of the 1920s. These weren't sketchy back-alley joints. Many were elegant establishments with live jazz, dancing, and cocktails. People from all walks of life would gather to drink illegally, creating this whole underground culture that defined the Roaring Twenties. Here's what the government didn't anticipate. Enforcing Prohibition required an army of agents, and these agents were human. When you're a federal agent making $2,000 a year and a bootlegger offers you $10,000 to look the other way, many people took the money. Corruption spread through law enforcement like a virus, making Prohibition nearly impossible to enforce. As the bootlegging business grew, so did the violence. Different gangs started fighting over territory, and these weren't street fights. These were full-scale wars with machine guns, bombs, and assassination attempts. The most famous example is the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, where Capone's men gunned down 7 members of a rival gang in broad daylight. By the late 1920s, public opinion was shifting. The violence was getting worse, corruption was rampant, and people were starting to question whether Prohibition was worth it. The stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed made the situation even worse. People needed jobs, and the government needed tax revenue, both of which could come from legalizing alcohol. What followed was this incredible cat-and-mouse game between bootleggers and federal agents. Criminals used everything from hidden compartments in cars to underground tunnels to move alcohol. They had speedboats that could outrun Coast Guard vessels, and they used coded language and sophisticated communication networks. Meanwhile, agents developed their own techniques for surveillance and raids. Both sides pushed technology to its limits. Bootleggers developed faster cars, better hiding spots, and more efficient distillation methods. The government invested in better radio communications, faster boats, and more advanced surveillance techniques. It was like an arms race, with each side constantly trying to stay one step ahead of the other. Before Prohibition, Italian-American criminal groups existed, but they were relatively small and disorganized. Prohibition changed everything. The massive profits from bootlegging allowed these groups to expand, organize, and establish the hierarchical structure we associate with the Mafia today. Families like the Gambinos, Genovese, and Lucchese all built their power during this period. One fascinating aspect that often gets overlooked is the role of women in bootlegging. Texas Guinan became famous for running speakeasies in New York, greeting customers with, "Hello, suckers." Gertrude Lithgow, known as the Bahama Queen, ran a massive rum-running operation from the Caribbean. These women proved that the criminal underworld wasn't just a man's game. The economic impact of Prohibition was staggering. The government lost billions in tax revenue while spending millions on enforcement. Meanwhile, the illegal alcohol trade was creating jobs and generating wealth, just not for law-abiding citizens. Some economists argue that bootlegging actually helped fund the economic boom of the 1920s. Bootlegging wasn't just an American phenomenon. It created international criminal networks that smuggled alcohol from Canada, Mexico, and even Europe. These connections would later be used for drug trafficking and other illegal activities. Prohibition essentially created the template for international organized crime that we still see today. Criminal organizations didn't just make money from alcohol, they invested in political power. They bought elections, controlled local governments, and even influenced federal politics. In some cities, the line between legitimate government and criminal enterprise became completely blurred. This corruption had lasting effects on American political culture. The FBI, which was still a relatively new organization, was forced to evolve rapidly during Prohibition. They developed new investigative techniques, expanded their jurisdiction, and built the foundation for modern federal law enforcement. In many ways, the FBI we know today was forged in the battles against Prohibition-era criminals. By the late 1920s, public opinion was shifting. The violence was getting worse, corruption was rampant, and people were starting to question whether Prohibition was worth it. The stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed made the situation even worse. People needed jobs, and the government needed tax revenue, both of which could come from legalizing alcohol. In 1929, President Hoover appointed the Wickersham Commission to study the effects of Prohibition. Their report, published in 1931, was damning. They found that Prohibition was largely unenforceable, had increased rather than decreased crime, and had corrupted law enforcement at every level. The writing was on the wall. When Franklin Roosevelt ran for president in 1932, he campaigned on a platform that included repealing Prohibition. The American people were ready for change. Roosevelt argued that legalizing alcohol would create jobs, generate tax revenue, and allow law enforcement to focus on real crimes instead of chasing after people who just wanted a drink. On December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified, repealing Prohibition. It was the first and only time in American history that a constitutional amendment was completely repealed by another amendment. The noble experiment was officially over, but its effects would last for decades. Here's the thing, though. Just because Prohibition ended didn't mean organized crime disappeared. These criminal organizations had built massive, sophisticated networks during the 1920s and early 1930s. They had money, political connections, and organizational structure. They simply moved into other illegal activities: gambling, labor racketeering, narcotics, and loan sharking. The corruption that spread during Prohibition didn't end in 1933 either. Many of the politicians, judges, and police officers who had been bought by bootleggers remained in their positions. This created a culture of corruption that persisted for decades, particularly in cities like Chicago, New York, and Kansas City. Prohibition and the gangsters it created became legendary in American popular culture. Movies like The Public Enemy and Scarface turned criminals like James Cagney's characters into anti-heroes. This romanticization of gangsters continues today in movies like The Godfather and Goodfellas, all tracing back to the Prohibition era. The parallels between Prohibition and modern drug policy are striking. Both created massive black markets, both led to violence and corruption, and both made criminals wealthy while failing to eliminate the prohibited substance. Many policy experts point to Prohibition as evidence that criminalization doesn't work and often makes problems worse. The techniques and organizational structure that the FBI developed during Prohibition became the foundation for modern federal law enforcement. The emphasis on surveillance, undercover operations, and financial investigations all trace back to the battles against bootleggers. Even today's approach to fighting organized crime uses methods developed during the 1920s and 1930s. Prohibition stands as perhaps the greatest example of unintended consequences in American history. What started as a moral crusade to improve society ended up creating the most powerful criminal organizations America had ever seen. It turned ordinary citizens into lawbreakers, corrupted law enforcement, and created a culture of disrespect for the law that took decades to repair. So there you have it, the incredible story of how America's attempt to ban alcohol accidentally created the modern American Mafia. Prohibition shows us how good intentions can lead to disastrous consequences, and how criminal organizations can exploit opportunities created by bad policy. The bootleggers may have lost the war when alcohol was legalized, but they won something much more valuable. They established organized crime as a permanent feature of American society. The FBI may have gotten better at fighting them, but they're still fighting the same basic battle today. What do you think? Could something like Prohibition happen again? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more incredible stories from American history. Do you think Prohibition could happen again in some form? And what would be the consequences today?